Jason Greenblatt is a former assistant to the president and special representative for international negotiations in the Trump administration. And he's now the founder of the Abraham Ventures company that connects Israel and American companies with Arab countries. And he hosts The Diplomat, which is a podcast for Newsweek. Welcome, Jason Greenblatt. I'm so honored. So, firstly, I'm going to start. This is real talk, so we have real conversation, real stuff. We don't hide, and my questions will be, very straight and real. Everybody has gone. Trump is gone. There's a new administration in America, in Israel. Where have you been? We haven't seen you. We miss you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me as a guest. I'm a big fan of real talk, not sound bites, not, things for politics. So I'm glad to be able to do this interview. Besides what you mentioned, I do spend a lot of time writing op-eds, being in the news to talk about the reality of the situation, the reality of Israel, the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the reality of Israel's Arab neighbors. In fact, one of the reasons I started The Diplomat is because I also like real talk. Instead of just seeing or hearing people in very short interviews where the listeners or the viewers can't really get a real understanding of what's going on, I spend somewhere between 25 to 40 minutes with people in the news. Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Joe Lieberman, the founder of NSO, the Israeli spyware company, from a few weeks ago. I wish I did that interview today because of what's going on in America in terms of boycotting NSO, which I don't know the details, but sounds political, sounds wrong, done without notice to Israel. So I do spend a lot of time out there, and I'm going to continue to do it because I think President Trump gave a few of us a platform, my friend David Friedman, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, and others, to be able to tell the truth, to be able to explain to people what we learned about the conflict that in many cases is so different than what is portrayed in the media and by some political figures around the world.
You have lived an historical moment with the Trump administration. I mean, I'm sure Trump is very, some people love him, some people hate him, but it was an historical moment. And the whole administration with you, with David Friedman, with Avi Berkowitz, religious Jews in leading positions in politics. Do you think that's brought to a rise in anti-Semitism? Did it create problems because of the power you had?
I don't think it created problems. I guess let me divide your question into two parts. Anti-Semitism and then what we brought to the table handling the Israeli-Palestinian file, the Israel file, the Israel-Arab file. Anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world. Our country, the United States, unfortunately has suffered from it as well. I don't think having high-profile Jews in political office or political positions or diplomatic positions is a problem. And in fact, I would encourage any Jewish person, any observant Jewish person even, to continue to seek those roles because it's the only way we can have a voice, and we shouldn't be afraid of some crazy nuts who are anti-Jewish. I consider myself extremely fortunate. And I'll segue into the second part of the equation by explaining that me being an observant Jew actually, I think, only allowed me to understand the conflict even more deeply. When we first joined the White House, Jared and I and Avi and then David in Israel, people used to make fun, what are these three, at the time it was Jared, David and I, what do these three observant Jews know anything about peace, anything about the Palestinians? And I would say on the contrary, we spoke the same language as the Arabs. They are religious people by nature. Religion is important to them, family is important to them. The fact that I needed to find a place to pray, the fact that I needed to observe kashrut, the fact that I wouldn't travel on Shabbat, it resonated to them. And I'll fast forward to very recently, maybe 3 weeks ago, I was heading to the Middle East for an important business trip. My father passed away in early September. I was at Minyan, I was saying Kaddish. The Minyan was going to start. I was going to be the leader of the prayer service, and my iPhone buzzed. I had already put it on silent because I was about to daven, to pray, and I saw the name on the screen happened to be a high-level official from the government that I've been waiting for weeks to confirm a meeting for my client. It was a really important phone call. So I'm sitting there sort of torn. Do I take the call, but then I won't be able to lead the prayer services, and Kaddish would be coming up very quickly. Do I ignore the call and then risk my client not getting the meeting that I had been waiting to confirm. What do? So I had 2 minutes, and I figured rather than start the call, I picked it up and jumped right into saying, so-and-so, I'm so sorry. Here's the situation. I'm at the prayer service. I need to lead the service. He cut me off right away. He apologized like 5 times. Oh, Jason, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were at the morning prayers. No problem at all. Please call me back. I have good news. No problem, no problem. So we speak the same language, right? Imagine if I would have said that to, I don't want to name countries in Europe, but in Europe they're very anti-religion. They pass laws against shechita, for example, things like that. It's different, but with the Arab countries it's very easy. And I'll add one last thing to answer your question. That was including the Palestinians, by the way. When I had my first meeting with them in early 2017, they put out a really huge spread. The food looked amazing. I couldn't touch it. But they made sure to have kosher food for me. So they, too, were very respectful of me being an observant Jew.
Do you think this historical moment of Jews in the White House, religious Jews, observant Jews, can ever return with or without Trump?
I do. Look, I'm very fortunate. In my career, I grew up at a time, I started my career at a time where people were accepting of religion, observant Jews. I started at a law firm where they had a mincha minyan every day. The law firm was very respectful to religious Jews. I then found myself working for Donald Trump for 20 years, who himself was just amazingly respectful of me being an observant Jew. Shortly before I joined the White House, I worked on a deal with the U.S. government, the old post office, the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., and we were close to signing the deal after many months of negotiation. They wanted to have one of the last important meetings on Pesach, on Yom Tov. Of course, I couldn't do it, so Ivaka couldn't do it. So I announced to this big table of government officials, I'm really sorry, we'll have to delay it by 2 days because I have the Passover observance. And right then, one of the lawyers for the U.S. government, herself Jewish, I don't know if she's observant or not, but she too said, I'm making my Seder and I also can't make it. And it wasn't a problem. The U.S. government was fine. A day or two later, I did an interview for a British reporter, Jewish, and when I told that story, he said that I'm incredibly fortunate, meaning me, not him. He said, because that wouldn't fly in his country. Like, it's just different. I think America, we are going through some challenges now, and religion is certainly part of the issue. It's part of the issue among, even within certain religious groups, and certainly for those who don't believe in religion or respect religion. But on an overall basis, in the course of my 25 plus, maybe 26 plus year career, wherever I was very fortunate that nobody ever held against me the fact that I observed Shabbat, I observed Kashrut. I found quite the opposite. The people were respectful. They may not believe in it. They may make some jokes about it here and there, but, funny and not offensive jokes. But I only found respect when I explained my situation of being an observant Jew.
Did you ever think one day you would be sitting in the White House? Is that where you were aiming, or it just came about?
Never in a million years. Maybe 6 years before I got the position, I took my kids and my wife to Washington, D.C. It was, a good family trip. We got to tour the White House. It's not easy to get those tickets, but through a connection, I was able to tour the White House. It never would have dawned on them. I felt lucky just to be able to tour the White House, to walk in through the gates of the White House, but it would never have dawned on me. And even during the campaign, when Donald Trump was running for president, I'd like to tell the story because I think it's sort of telling. My wife and I used to watch this show. It's called The West Wing. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's an interesting show. It's funny. It's has some really good storylines and all that. It's a little bit old, but we would always close the show, shut the TV off after we watch an episode, and we'd look at each other and we'd say sort of like, even if he wins, there's just no way that you would go, because Washington it's a tough place. It's a very different mindset when you're living in what we call the Beltway. So even during the months leading up to him winning, and then a few weeks later asking me to join him, never would have thought it would happen. And it was just an incredible blessing for me to be able to do it. I lived in Washington. I actually had to separate from my family for those 3 years, so we were only together Shabbat and Sunday. Most of the time, my wife would load up the kids, all 6 kids, in the minivan, load up all the food for Shabbat,
Wow.
drive to Washington. One of the reasons I ended up having to leave after nearly 3 years is it takes its toll living separate from your wife and kids, except on Shabbat and part of Sunday.
You've been working for Trump for 25 years, and there's been said a lot. Just a thought to us, what it was, and who is Trump?
I guess I'll answer it in two ways. The first is I worked for him 20 years in the private sector, almost 3 years at the White House. In 23 years, we got into one disagreement. So all the nonsense that you're hearing, from the different books that are out there to attack him and how some of the news media portray him, that was not my experience. My experience was somebody who was decisive, somebody who always had a thirst to get deals done, to make progress, didn't like to take no for an answer, but who also listened. So if I went into his office, whether in the private sector or at the White House, and he had some ideas and I disagreed, I was able to air my thoughts. Sometimes he agreed, sometimes he didn't. He didn't agree, but he would listen to everyone, and then he would make his decision. As the owner of the company in the private sector, as the President of the United States, he's allowed to do that. When people complain and they don't like that they don't get listened to, well, he was elected president, we weren't. The second thing, I think, probably the best way you could understand him is with the announcement, the recognition of Jerusalem and moving the embassy to Jerusalem. So you had all these people who, after, we kept it very tight. We weren't going to telegraph what we were doing because we understood that people would try to undermine the decision. And when it finally, when we finally started sharing the news, he got so many phone calls. We all did, but, the president got so many phone calls. You can't do it. This is what's going to happen. There's going to be a war. There's going to be this. There's going to be that. He has a way of understanding, reading the situation, taking advice, and nevertheless being courageous. You had president after president who made promises to do it. Nobody's kept their word. They all use this convenient waiver. He's the only one who has tenacity to get things done and to read the situation. And here we are, several years later. He read the situation correctly. It was all nonsense. So I think those two stories kind of tell you the Donald Trump that I know.
Is he personable? Is he more like, his human side? He doesn't look human sometimes.
Very personable. First of all, he's actually quite funny. Very warm. When my kids used to fly in his plane with him to Florida, he would walk up and down the aisles offering them snacks. He'd look at the back of the package to determine whether that was kosher. But he was always respectful to me and my wife and my kids.
One thought of you on the new Israeli administration without Bibi?
Look, it's no secret I am a Bibi fan. But from what I've been watching, I think Prime Minister Bennett is doing a very solid job. I have mixed feelings about the coalition, but it seems to be working. The truth is I don't read the papers in Hebrew, I read them in English, which means my consumption of what I see going on is a bit missing. I don't quite get everything that's going on. From the English language papers, I think they're focusing on what needs to be focused on. They just passed the budget, Mazal Tov, finally, after all this time. I think that they are certainly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not doing anything inappropriate. So far, I think things are calm the way they should be, and hopefully Israel can now get back to the business of governing and doing the great things that the State of Israel has always done.
And now you see the new administration, that they're basically trying to revert to everything you've been trying to build, including the Abraham Accords. And I mean, it's continuing, but you promise for new countries were supposed to, continue this, and it's just like hoping. I mean, I hope it continues, but I don't know how do you feel as you were there and you see it basically being undone slowly?
So I don't want to be critical of everything the Biden administration is doing. So for example, on the Abraham Accords, it's not quite their fault that there's less momentum. There are certain things that they should have done. One, they should have used the name Abraham Accords from the moment they stepped into office. It took them many months of calling it normalization agreements and not giving Donald Trump and the Trump administration the credit for what they did. They eventually started using the name around the first year anniversary. So good for them that they finally accepted the name and that they even gave credit to the administration finally. But they can't really cause more countries, what I like to refer to as countries who haven't yet signed the Abraham Accords. They can't cause them to sign it. There may be some trades that they could do, but what I always say to people now is those countries who want to join forces with Israel for security reasons, for economic reasons, for the sake of bringing, warmth back into the region and stability back into the region, that train has left the station and they don't need the United States as the conductor anymore. When those countries are ready to do it, it might help to have the United States involved. They don't need the United States involved. So I don't want to blame the Biden administration for the lack of progress. I think it's a bit premature. Where I do think they're making some serious errors is, number one, Iran. At the beginning of the administration until very recently, they were just so dead set on trying to, I don't know if I should say re-enter the JCPOA or come up with some new faulty, crazy agreement. And that, I think, is a mistake. But as I think they're finally realizing, even though they've just announced that there are going to be talks in Vienna, the messages I'm hearing from the administration, at least the public remarks, is a little bit more realistic. I still fear what's going to happen. I'm not sure if they really understand that the the leadership in Iran, they're not interested in the same things that everybody else is. I think they've alienated some important friends and allies. Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia is key to the region's stability. I think how they treated Saudi Arabia was wrong, and I think it's treatment like that that just causes more instability and fear in the region. So I definitely think their Middle East policy needs a lot more focus, a lot more realism. And I guess the last part of it is how they're treating the Palestinians. They want to reopen the consulate. I think that's a big mistake. Just speaking plainly as an American, I don't want my tax dollars to open up another mission in a city that already has an embassy. There's no reason for that. We need our tax dollars here at home to do a whole bunch of things, even if there wasn't COVID. But the devastation that COVID brought to this country, our tax dollars need to be used for wiser things. And then, of course, there's the argument that why would we need a Palestinian mission in a city that is supposed to be one Jerusalem in the capital, which is in Israel, as the U.S. recognized many years ago with the law that it passed, and Donald Trump made his historic and bold decision to finally not sign those waivers and recognize it. So I think they need a reality check about the Palestinians. That doesn't mean I'm anti-Palestinian. I'm not. Doesn't mean I'm anti-peace. I'm not. But I think they have to treat the Palestinians not as children, which they often do. The Palestinians complain and therefore they give them this and they give them that, but treat them and demand a higher standard from Palestinian leadership so the Palestinian people could live better lives and together with the Israelis maybe be able to forge a path forward.
The Biden administration is putting a lot of pressure on the new settlements, so tell me what you think about this.
I think that's one of the big mistakes that the Biden administration and prior administrations have done. First of all, I don't even like to use the word settlements anymore. I started calling them towns, cities, and neighborhoods a couple of years ago when I was in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, and I think people should completely switch to that name because originally I understand the origin of the word, but it's become a very negative word. People speak as if, the Israelis are building these mobile home camps, gobbling up land and all that other things. They don't understand that these are cities that people live in, kids go to school in, people work in. So let's first call it what they are. The second is, there is no peace not because of, I'll use the word settlements here just because it's easier.
Yeah.
The lack of peace isn't because of settlements. It is, unfortunately, the first thing out of any diplomat's mouth and out of many politicians' mouth. I can't tell you how many meetings I have been in around the world and in the White House where, they take out their talking card and the first thing is they complain about Israel and the so-called settlements. It's just not true. They say they want a contiguous piece of land. Let's assume there's a possibility of a Palestinian state, whether based on the plan that we wrote for President Trump with President Trump or something else. How could it be with the settlements? You know what? I live in Teaneck, New Jersey. I used to go to Manhattan every day for work, and I'd go over a bridge or I'd cross a tunnel. There are ways to get people around, efficient ways to get people around without having to have everything contiguous. Contiguity doesn't work, and nobody should be uprooted for a peace agreement. What kind of peace is that? Another thing I'd like to point out is nobody talks about the Palestinians building, right? There are Palestinian settlements. Palestinians may not want to go to Israel for approval. That's ideological. They may not get some approval. I know there's talk now about the Israeli government approving settler homes, Palestinian homes rather, which I'm not against if that's what the Israeli government wants. But the focus always is on what Israel is doing wrong. I'd like to see those same diplomats talking about the Palestinian building as well. I think anybody who speaks about it ought to visit, ought to understand, ought to meet the people who live there so they understand what they're talking about. Stop calling them settlers, they're Israelis. They're an amazing people. And I think it is one of the least understood issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The more people should focus on it.
Okay, let's get to your podcast now. This is your new adventure. Where do we see it? How can we listen to it? And who's your target? Who are your guests?
Thanks for the plug. Really appreciate it. The target is everybody, right? Anybody who's, let's say, my 15-year-old son enjoys listening to it. He's mature enough. I think certainly teenagers could listen to it, all the way to older people. Yes. I try to have a very wide number of guests, and not just on the political side. So I did start out with the politics by having Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo and Joe Lieberman, but I also moved to the business side. So we had, for example, the CEO of TripAdvisor on recently. We have had, as I mentioned, the founder of NSO, the Israeli spyware company. Today's episode was with a journalist from The Atlantic who was talking about, who really works from home and how much do we really understand American society in terms of who's having to work from home during COVID. Earlier this week, I had a firefighter from 9/11 who very sadly got leukemia from the courageous work that he did on 9/11, rescuing people and cleaning up the site. So it's meant to allow people to think more deeply about today's societal issues, today's political issues. It's very much not journalism in the sense that I don't try to come with an agenda where I try to box somebody into questions, but a little bit like this interview where I want to have it free-flowing, people who are interesting, people who could teach, people who could inspire, people who my audience will find interesting. And thankfully, Newsweek just told me last week the numbers are growing very nicely. They're very pleased, and we hope to sort of branch out with the podcast into other areas as well.
Amazing.
As far as where to find it, it's on Spotify, it's on Apple, it's called The Diplomat, powered by Newsweek, and pretty much anywhere where podcasts can be heard, you can catch it. So I hope your listeners give it a try. I have a studio downstairs. We now have plans for me to go on the road a little bit to do some of the podcasts. In fact, it's probably premature to announce it, but in 2 weeks' time, I'm supposed to have one off-site with a former diplomat, a former friend of mine, at a particular location. I hope it works out, but they're going to be sending me podcast equipment that I could take on the road to further expand the number of guests and hopefully attract even a bigger audience.
How does it feel to be interviewed and not being the interviewer?
It's good. I was not public. I wasn't a public person when I joined the White House, and they said, "All right, now you got to go talk in front of a camera." It was new to me, but you get used to it very quickly. You realize that if you speak the truth, if you speak from your convictions, it's easy to be on my side of the camera, not the podcast side of being interviewed, and it was fine. And I'll tell you a funny story, because the only time I had a hiccup was on the day of the Abraham Accords. I was at the White House on the lawn, and they sort of lined up a whole bunch of TV interviews for me to do by the White House to support the Abraham Accords. So I had one interview. I'm not going to say which station it was, but it was a very hostile interview. Although I was told that the media company actually was very pro-Trump. So I finished that interview, not squirming, but just surprised at the questions, because I thought it was going to be a very pro-Abraham Accords, pro-Trump administration interview. I go to the next interview, and they tell me it's that same media organization. I said, well, who was that? Why are they here twice? They told me who it was, then it all made sense. There are some media organizations that are, all they want to do is get their agenda out. I was very fortunate, generally speaking, other than that story, to have honest journalists come in who really want to understand. In fact, I will say this week, I'm hoping, I think tomorrow actually, I have a journalist, Palestinian-born, from an Arab news station, who was one of my best, I was a guest for her show. She was one of my best interviewers. Very early on in the administration, the Arab channel aired the entire interview. She was honest, she was thoughtful in her questions, and now it's my turn to interview her. So hopefully that podcast will go well. It'll be interesting to see her on the other side of the equation.
I want to just close with a personal note. Firstly, if one of your children wants to be in politics eventually, how will you react to it?
A question I've never been asked before. It's a great question. I think I would encourage it. It's hard. those that serve the government, the U.S., Israel, elsewhere, it's not an easy job. People think it's so glamorous. It's not. People think all sorts of things that are just not true. But in the end, from my experience, I was able to potentially help. And in the end, with the signing of the Abraham Accords, did help millions and millions of people through our efforts. So you had a whole team of people working on this. And you walk away thinking, wow, look what we were able to accomplish. So it's hard, it's challenging. There's all sorts of people that you have to be careful for, people who stab you in the back, people who really don't want to help you with the agenda of the leadership or whatever it is. But if you can manage in almost a combat situation to keep your eye on the ball and really work towards what the goal is, I would say it's there's nothing like it.
Do you miss the White House?
I don't. I loved it. It was amazing. But I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I have 6 kids to take care of. So in the meantime, since I got home during COVID, 3 of my 6 kids either have gotten married or are about to get married. I would have missed. Thank you. I would have missed the entire dating process. I would have missed getting close to my new children. The 3 people the 3 young adults who are going to be joining my family. So yes, it's great to be able to do it. But at the same time, I have responsibilities at home and a big family to love, and I wouldn't trade what I did at the White House for anything in the world, but I wouldn't trade coming home and being with my family for anything in the world.
The Rebbe. Did you ever have the chance to meet him, or something that got connected to Chabad?
I never met him. I'm very connected to Chabad. I have a lot of great stories about Chabad around the world and the amazing work that they do. One famous story had to do with me getting stuck for Shabbat in Virginia unexpectedly, and a very formerly super wealthy woman, not Jewish, realized that I was stuck there and found me the local Chabad. So I had a place to eat and a place to daven for Shabbos.
She found you.
She found him, yeah, which is amazing. Because I don't know that I would have found it. It should have dawned on me, Chabad must be in the city, but it was so last minute that I got stuck there. I wasn't even thinking it, so she found it. So I never had the bracha of being able to meet the Babajirabi, but clearly from the work that I see of all of his emissaries around the world, including, by the way, in Dubai before the Abraham Accords, he had exactly the right message. So I'm a big supporter, a big believer.
I'm so happy that you managed to do this. It was very important to meet you, to hear what you have to say. You've been through so much, you know so much, you've seen so much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for being here.